The night the storm came, the world felt like it was coming apart. The old pines along the winding backroads of rural Oregon bent and groaned beneath the wind. Rain lashed the windshield so hard it sounded like handfuls of gravel, and thunder made the forest shudder. Inside his black SUV, Jonathan Reed's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched, his mind racing faster than the wipers could clear the glass. In the back seat, 6-year-old Lila stared at the window, her small face pale and beaded with sweat. She pressed her hands against her ears, even though she couldn't hear the thunder, only feel its heavy vibration in her bones. Her fever had been getting worse since yesterday. Her eyes flickered with confusion. She recognized the darkness of the forest. But not this road. Not at this hour. Not with her father's voice so tight, his answers so short. "We're going on a special adventure, sweetheart," Jonathan had told her earlier, not meeting her eyes in the rear view. He tried to sound cheerful, but every word tasted sour in his mouth. The guilt was eating him alive, but shame was stronger. He'd spent months wrestling with the truth. Lila was different, and he didn't know how to love a child he couldn't fix. He'd tried doctors, tutors, specialists. None of it made a difference. The whispers at his country club, the looks from colleagues, the pity from neighbors. It all fed a storm inside him that he didn't know how to quiet. So he told himself this was mercy, that maybe someone else somewhere would do a better job. The road narrowed, and the trees pressed in. Jonathan slowed and pulled off at a muddy clearing he'd found the day before. He parked, engine running, his hands trembling. For a long moment he sat there, rain drumming on the roof. "Come on, Lila, let's see something special," he forced out, opening her door. Lila hesitated. She could smell the wet earth, the sharp metallic scent of coming lightning, the unfamiliar cold. Her nightgown clung to her damp skin. Jonathan lifted her out of the car, set her on her feet, and knelt to zip up her small raincoat. He pressed the old locket from her mother into her hand, closed her fingers around it, and avoided her gaze. He stood, heart hammering in his chest. Lila looked up at him wide-eyed. She tried to sign, "Daddy? Home?" Her lips moved silently, her hands forming shapes he'd never learned to understand. Jonathan's eyes burned. "Stay here. Someone will come for you. I'm sorry," he said, his voice cracking. Then he turned, walked quickly to the SUV, and drove off, taillights vanishing through the trees, the engine sound swallowed by the rain. For a moment, Lila stood frozen, her breath forming tiny clouds. Rain stung her cheeks and pooled around her shoes. Confusion twisted her stomach. This wasn't a game. Daddy was gone, and the dark was closing in. She started to sob, soft and wordless, hugging herself for warmth. She didn't know how long she stood there, the world turning colder and the fever making the forest spin. Her legs buckled, and she dropped to her knees, mud oozing into her socks. A flash of lightning painted the trees white for a heartbeat. Then everything went black again. Somewhere just out of sight, golden eyes watched from the underbrush. Shadow, a stray German shepherd who'd learned to survive the hard way, was tracking the scent of shelter from the storm. He'd been prowling the woods for days, nose to the wind, ears pricked for the sound of trouble. The thunder and wind barely bothered him, but something else did. The smell of fear and sickness, the strange, broken whimpers he heard through the noise. As Lila's cries floated through the trees, Shadow moved closer, drawn by instinct. Lila didn't notice him at first, her mind clouded by fever. She shivered violently, fingers curled around the locket. Her lips shaped silent pleas. "Mommy, Daddy, help." but the woods answered only with the roar of the storm. A chill deeper than the rain crept into her bones. Her eyelids fluttered. The world tilted. Just as her strength failed, and she slumped onto her side in the mud, a warm, rough tongue touched her cheek. She flinched, tried to move, but the sensation was gentle, persistent. Through half-open eyes, she saw the blur of a large dog, soaked, scarred, but somehow calm amid the chaos. Shadow nuzzled her, sniffing her hair, licking away the rain and tears. His body was tense, every muscle ready to defend this small, broken thing he'd found in the woods. Lila reached for him, fingers trembling. Shadow didn't back away. Instead, he pressed close, letting her cling to his fur. Lightning lit the clearing again, illuminating the unlikely pair. The abandoned girl and the stray dog, united by the storm, both searching for something neither had ever truly known. Safety, family, belonging. Lila's fever made her head spin, but the warmth of Shadow's body was a lifeline. She buried her face in his coat, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. He whined softly, then, moving with the determined patience only a dog can muster, he nudged and pulled, urging her to crawl, then stagger to her feet, her hand clutching his collar. Guided by Shadow, Lila stumbled deeper into the trees, away from the clearing where hope had nearly been lost. Somewhere ahead, through the slanting rain, a faint glow appeared, a distant porch light, the promise of refuge. Shadow led her on, never letting her fall, every sense alive to danger, and every step a stubborn act of hope. Behind them, the storm raged on. But for the first time since her father abandoned her, Lila was not alone. Shadow's thick, wet fur was Lila's anchor as they stumbled through tangled underbrush, battered by rain and haunted by the wild cracks of thunder. Every few feet, her legs threatened to collapse, and the world swirled with feverish confusion. But Shadow, instinctive, relentless, would not let her give up. He barked softly, encouraging her, his big head nudging her forward. When she tripped, he pressed his body under her arm, steadying her as though he'd done it 1,000 times before. Sometimes Lila would stop, whimpering, overcome by chills, her breath trembling in the dark. Shadow would sit beside her, nuzzle her cheek, and lick her fingers, patient, determined, as if he understood everything she could not say. Through the trees, Lila caught a flicker of warm light, a farmhouse porch lamp glowing golden through sheets of rain. She did not know how far it was, maybe half a mile, maybe just a dream, but Shadow seemed certain. He sniffed the air, checked over his shoulder, and kept leading her toward hope. Behind them, deep in the storm-torn woods, only broken tire tracks and a small blue ribbon from Lila's hair marked the place she'd been abandoned. It felt like hours before they reached the muddy gravel drive. The farmhouse was sturdy and plain, paint peeling on the porch rail, but the window was aglow with the soft promise of home. In the kitchen, Helen Parker, her red hair tucked in a fraying braid, her hands calloused from years of work, stood washing dishes, humming a low tune. Her father, Tom, white-haired and sharp-eyed despite the lines of age, was dozing in his old recliner, a worn newspaper on his lap. The storm worried Helen. She'd lost count of the times she'd checked the barn doors, the generator, the kitchen window. Suddenly, a loud, urgent barking cut through the howl of wind. Helen wiped her hands, heart pounding. Dogs weren't uncommon out here, sometimes strays, sometimes wild. But this bark was different. Desperate, insistent. She peered through the glass and saw, just beyond the porch light, a hulking shadow moving in the rain. Then, as lightning flashed, a small shape clinging to its side. "Oh God! Dad! There's someone out there!" Helen grabbed her raincoat and rushed to the door, Tom close behind. She flung it open and stepped into the storm, rain stinging her face. Shadow barked again, standing over Lila, who had collapsed on her knees at the foot of the porch steps. Helen knelt, her heart twisting as she took in the fever-flushed cheeks, the wild hair, the locket clenched in a tiny fist. "Sweetheart? Can you hear me? Are you hurt?" she asked, voice soft but urgent. Lila's eyes barely focused. Her lips trembled as she tried to form a wordless plea, but all that came was a whimper. Helen scooped the child into her arms, shocked by the heat radiating from her skin. Shadow growled low, protective, uncertain, until Helen looked him square in the eye and whispered, "It's okay, big guy. We're going to help her. You're a good boy." The dog's growl faded to a worried whine, and he pressed close to Helen's side, unwilling to let Lila out of his sight. Inside, Tom had already set a blanket by the fire. Helen laid Lila down, checking for wounds, and quickly realized the child's hearing was gone. Her eyes darted to their lips, but she responded to no sound, only touch and sight. Helen's medical training, years spent as a volunteer nurse, kicked in. She pressed a cool cloth to Lila's forehead, spooned water to her lips, and searched for identification. The only clue, a tarnished silver locket, which Lila clutched as if it held her entire life. Shadow circled restlessly, always placing himself between Lila and the door. When Helen tried to step away, Lila's hand shot out, clutching the dog's fur. He lay down beside her, his heavy head on her chest, the two of them breathing in sync. Tom, watching all this, shook his head in awe. "Never seen a dog so loyal to a stranger," he muttered. The fever worsened as the night deepened. Helen and Tom worked in shifts, checking Lila's temperature, sponging her face, trying to coax her to drink. Every time she drifted into restless sleep, she would wake, panicked, unless Shadow was near. He seemed to know when to lick her hand or press close, calming her with his steady presence. Helen made a quick call to their neighbor, Miss Betty, who'd retired from teaching a few years ago. Betty was a legend in their small town, a patient, kind soul who'd spent decades teaching children with special needs. She was also fluent in American Sign Language. "Bring her here right away," Helen begged. "She's deaf. She's so scared." Betty didn't hesitate. Through the storm, she arrived, umbrella in hand, her gentle smile radiating reassurance. By dawn, the fever began to break. Lila slept, curled against Shadow, her chest rising and falling with exhausted relief. Helen and Tom watched, still anxious, but hopeful for the first time that night. When Lila finally opened her eyes, Betty was waiting. She knelt beside the bed, introduced herself in slow, careful signs, and Lila's face lit up in recognition. She answered with trembling hands, spelling her name, Lila, and Betty nodded, encouraging her, speaking each word aloud for Helen and Tom's benefit. The relief was overwhelming. For the first time since the storm, Lila seemed to understand she was safe. She reached for Helen, then for Shadow, her eyes shining with gratitude. Betty interpreted her simple signs: dog safe, home, family. The Parkers nodded, tears glistening. "You're safe here, honey," Helen whispered. "We'll take care of you, all of us." Shadow settled at Lila's feet, his eyes never leaving her, as if promising to guard her through any storm, no matter how wild, no matter who might come looking. And in that quiet farmhouse, as the rain eased to a gentle tap on the roof, a new kind of family was born, one forged by courage, compassion, and the loyalty of a stray dog who refused to let hope die. The first true morning in the farmhouse brought a hush that felt almost holy, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Pale sunlight struggled through the thinning storm clouds, turning the raindrops on the window into scattered jewels. In the quiet kitchen, Helen brewed coffee, her mind busy with worry and hope, while Tom busied himself with chores, making more noise than usual to keep the anxious energy at bay. Lila awoke slowly, tangled in blankets with Shadow's great head still resting across her feet. For a split second, panic returned. The unfamiliar room, the heavy ache of fever, the absence of her father's car, and the dull, silent pressure where sound should be. But then Shadow lifted his head and licked her hand, and she remembered. She had survived the night. She was somewhere safe. Miss Betty arrived again just after sunrise, bringing a plate of sweet rolls and a well-worn book of sign language illustrations. She approached Lila with gentle, unhurried movements, smiling warmly as she knelt beside the child's bed. "Good morning, Lila," she signed, her fingers sure and graceful, her eyes kind. "I'm Betty. This is a safe place." Lila's eyes brightened. Her fingers echoed the signs with hesitant precision. "Safe. Dog. Thank you." Helen and Tom watched this exchange, their relief plain. "You really think she understands, Betty?" Tom asked, voice rough with emotion. Betty nodded. "She's smart. She just needs a way to talk to us, and to trust us." She turned to Lila, showing her the signs for family, friend, help, hungry. Lila copied them, giggling softly when Shadow barked as if in approval. Betty laughed and signed dog again, pointing at Shadow, who immediately wagged his tail, tongue lolling with pride. For the next hour, Betty led a slow, gentle lesson. She drew pictures with Lila, letting her tell her story as best she could. Her home, her father, a house near a river, and a small blue ribbon like the one she'd lost in the woods. She held up the silver locket and watched as Lila traced its heart-shaped outline, then pressed it to her chest. Lila sketched a stick-figure woman with a yellow halo of hair and a big smile, her mother gone but not forgotten. She drew a bigger figure, her father, always at a distance, his face uncertain. Finally, she drew herself and the dog together, with the farmhouse and sun shining behind them. "Family? Safe?" she signed. Helen's throat tightened. "You are safe here, Lila," she repeated, holding her hand to her heart and mimicking the sign for safe that Betty had shown her. Tom, though less nimble with his hands, watched intently, eager to learn. He practiced the sign for thank you until Lila giggled and showed him how to move his thumb just so. Each small victory was met with a smile or a gentle touch, connection built without words, only gestures and understanding. Shadow, always present, became Lila's shadow in every sense. He watched the adults closely and quickly picked up on Lila's cues. When she signed "Sit, Stay, Friend," he followed, earning delighted laughter. If she got frustrated, he would nuzzle her hand or rest his paw on her knee, and the tension would melt away. When Helen explained to Miss Betty that Lila had never responded to sound, never startled at slamming doors or barking dogs, Betty nodded, her face somber. She's been this way for a long time. She's learned to look at faces, not listen for voices. The days settled into a gentle routine. In the mornings, Betty came by for lessons, teaching everyone in the house simple signs. Lila absorbed each one eagerly, light, dark, food, love, and taught them back to Shadow, who seemed to understand the meaning even if he didn't know the signs. Helen was astonished by how quickly her own hands picked up the shapes and how natural it became to sign as she spoke. Sometimes when the rain let up, Tom took Lila and Shadow out to the barn to feed the chickens or collect eggs. He taught her the sign for danger. 2 fingers flicked sharply and pointed at the old electric fence, shaking his head with mock sternness until Lila giggled. He explained with signs and pictures how to stay safe on the property, where to go if she was scared, how to use the house's flashing light alarm system to call for help, and how to signal for a neighbor if something happened when the adults were gone. Trust, at first as fragile as spider silk, grew strong. Lila clung to Shadow as if he were her lifeline. Every night, she fell asleep with one hand tangled in his fur, the other cradling her locket. Shadow would not budge from her side, even when Helen tried to lure him away with scraps of roast chicken or a soft blanket by the fire. Only Lila could coax him to move, from her bed to the kitchen, out to the porch, or back again, his loyalty absolute and his protectiveness unbreakable. Miss Betty, patient as ever, watched all this with a gentle pride. She encouraged Lila to draw her feelings when she couldn't find the words, sometimes happiness, sometimes fear or confusion, but more often now, hope. The process of learning sign language together, as a family, turned the old farmhouse into a place of laughter, gentle teasing, and a quiet pride. Helen marveled at how communication, once a source of frustration and loneliness, became an act of love, a bridge that drew them all closer. One afternoon, after a lesson, Helen found Lila staring out the window at the rain, her hand tracing signs on the cold glass. When Helen sat beside her, Lila looked up and signed, "Home. Family." Helen smiled, tears threatening, and signed back, slowly, carefully, "Yes. Home, family, always." And for the first time, Lila smiled without fear. Life at the Parker farmhouse soon found its own quiet rhythm, shaped by routines both old and new. Every day brought a little more sunlight, a little less fear. The land was still drenched from the storm, but green shoots pushed through the mud, and the air took on the scent of growing things and the faintest hope. For Lila, each morning felt like waking in a different world, a place where home meant safety, where people smiled and reached out their hands, and where her every word, even silent, was met with warmth and patience. The Parker home, sturdy and unpretentious, seemed to rearrange itself around her needs. Helen, with her easy smile and gentle touch, became the steady sun at the center. She made sure Lila always had a clear view of her face and hands, adjusting lamps and opening curtains to catch the best light for signing. Tom's gruff exterior softened each time Lila looked his way, and he took to keeping a notepad in his shirt pocket so he could sketch simple diagrams and signs whenever words failed. Even Miss Betty, already a frequent visitor, became part of the household fabric, her lessons so gentle and creative that Lila hardly realized she was learning. Early one Saturday, Helen gathered everyone in the living room for what she called Safety Day. The storm that had changed everything still echoed in their minds, a reminder of how quickly life could become dangerous. Helen explained, with signs and speech and drawings, that Lila needed ways to call for help, to warn others, and to keep herself safe if anything ever happened again. Miss Betty, with her teacher's instinct, started with the basics. She introduced signs for flashlight, alarm, door, fire, help, safe, danger, and neighbor. She showed Lila how to flick the porch lights on and off as a signal, and how to tap hard on the kitchen window to get attention if she was outside. They practiced together, Helen and Tom learning the signs right alongside Lila. Sometimes they all laughed at Tom's clumsy fingers, or cheered when Lila's hands flew gracefully through a sentence. Shadow, as always, was there for every lesson. He watched closely, tilting his head as if puzzling out the meaning of each sign. When Lila signed danger and pointed toward the barn, Shadow perked up, running to the door as if ready to defend her. If she signed safe, he'd trot back and press his head to her leg, tail wagging. Helen started to believe the big German shepherd really understood. Maybe not the words, but the feeling behind them, the shape of Lila's need and trust. After lunch, Tom set up a pretend emergency drill. He flicked the main power off, plunging the house into a cool, gray hush. Lila was startled at first, but quickly remembered the sign for flashlight and the special drawer in the kitchen. Shadow found her at the drawer, tail thumping as she handed him a flashlight to guard. Together they navigated the dark hallway, Lila using her new signs to reassure herself, her heart pounding but proud. At the end of the drill, everyone celebrated with homemade cookies, and Lila drew a bright picture of Shadow holding a flashlight in his mouth, the hero of the day. Miss Betty also began teaching feeling signs, so Lila could share more than her needs. She could show when she was scared, happy, angry, or tired. The family practiced at dinner, turning every meal into a chance for Lila to lead. Helen loved seeing Lila's confidence grow, her face shining with pride as her hands danced through the air, expressing feelings that had always been locked away. As spring advanced, Helen and Tom invited trusted neighbors over to meet Lila and learn the basics of her signs. There were awkward moments at first. Some neighbors stumbled over their fingers or spoke too loudly, not realizing that Lila simply read their faces and hands. But soon, laughter filled the farmhouse as Lila demonstrated how to sign hello, friend, thank you, and shadow. The German shepherd, sensing the importance, sat proudly at her side, soaking in the attention. With every lesson, the sense of community deepened. The Parkers made sure Lila knew she had allies everywhere. The next farm over, the small store in town, even the local sheriff who promised to learn a few signs himself. Helen wrote up an emergency plan and gave copies to the neighbors. They all promised to look out for the little girl and her big dog, making sure Lila never again felt alone or unseen. The farmhouse itself adapted in subtle ways. Helen installed a flashing doorbell that lit up whenever someone knocked, and placed a special alarm in Lila's room that vibrated her pillow in the morning. Tom fixed up an old walkie-talkie set so Helen could talk to him in the barn, and Miss Betty found a weather radio with a visual alert system. Lila was fascinated by the gadgets, especially when she realized she could help test them and teach Shadow to react. With safety came freedom. Lila began to explore more, walking the property with Shadow always by her side. She learned how to feed the chickens, plant seedlings in the garden, and even help Tom fix the old tractor. Every small victory added a new spark of confidence. When she tripped over a root one afternoon and skinned her knee, she signed help and Shadow dashed to the porch, barking until Helen came running. The adults marveled at how quickly Lila and Shadow worked as a team, both watching out for each other with an understanding deeper than words. One warm evening, after a full day of lessons and laughter, Helen tucked Lila into bed. Lila touched her hand, eyes earnest, and signed love. Helen blinked back tears, then signed it back, adding always, a sign Miss Betty had taught her just for this moment. Shadow curled up beside Lila, his eyes soft and trusting. In the quiet of the night, Lila drifted off, her hand resting on Shadow's back, her heart lighter than it had been in months. The storm that once threatened to destroy her had given way to something new, the slow, steady growth of safety, confidence, and family. And as sleep claimed her, Lila knew deep down that whatever storms might come, she would never face them alone again. The weeks rolled by, soft and golden, the world outside the farmhouse slowly waking from winter's grip. Daffodils poked through the thawed earth, and Lila's cheeks grew pink with health and play. Each day brought new signs and words, her hands quicker, her smile brighter, her trust deeper. The family bond tightened, with Shadow, the ever-watchful sentinel, never more than a few steps from Lila's side. For Helen and Tom, their home had never felt so full. For Lila, the old ache of abandonment slowly faded, replaced by laughter, belonging, and the easy, wordless love of her loyal dog. But even as new roots grew, the past was not done with them. On a gray Monday, the peaceful spell was broken. Jonathan Reed, drawn by rumors and gossip, returned to the small Oregon town. He arrived in his immaculate sedan, suit pressed, eyes hollow, as if the storm that had swept away his daughter had also hollowed him out. Jonathan had come for business, or so he told himself and others. But beneath the veneer, fear coiled tight in his chest. Fear of exposure, of disgrace, of old secrets clawing into the light. He heard the talk at the general store first. "Did you hear about the girl?" whispered Mrs. Langley, her arms loaded with canned soup. "Survived a storm, found by that Parker family. Deaf as a post, poor thing, but sweet as pie. They say she's got a guardian angel, a big German shepherd, follows her everywhere." Jonathan's hands shook as he paid for his coffee. He forced a smile, barely listening as the clerk described the miraculous rescue, the strange dog, the way Lila seemed to belong at the Parker place. But inside, shame and panic warred. He had left her there. If word got out, if anyone found out the truth, his reputation would be ruined. That night, Jonathan drove to the Parker farmhouse, headlights cutting through the dusk. He watched from the end of the drive as Lila, healthy, laughing, her hair shining in the porch light, fed shadow scraps from her plate. Helen stood nearby, a gentle hand on Lila's shoulder, her face filled with a mother's pride. Jonathan's breath caught. For a moment, a pang of longing twisted in his gut. But it was quickly replaced by anger. How dare they keep her? How dare they make him look like the villain? He waited until the next morning, then strode up the path, every step hard with purpose. Helen saw him through the window, and her heart plummeted. She opened the door, Tom close behind. "Can we help you?" Helen asked, voice calm but wary. Jonathan straightened, voice cold. "I've come for my daughter. I want her back immediately." Helen's arms unconsciously blocked the door. "She's safe here, Mr. Reed. She's only just begun to heal. Please, don't make this harder on her." "She's my daughter," Jonathan snapped. "You have no right, no legal standing. I want her returned, or I'll involve the authorities." Lila appeared in the hallway, clutching Shadow's collar. Her face went pale at the sight of Jonathan, her hands trembling. Shadow stepped in front of her, body tense, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Tom knelt down and signed safe to Lila, repeating it aloud. Miss Betty, who'd arrived for the day's lesson, watched the scene with narrowed eyes. "Let's all sit down and talk," Helen suggested, trying to keep the peace. Jonathan refused, his jaw set. He turned on his heel and stormed off, slamming his car door so hard it echoed through the fields. Within hours, the sheriff was at the door, his badge glinting, his expression troubled. Jonathan had filed for immediate custody, claiming abduction and parental rights. But the sheriff, a broad-shouldered man named Dale Jenkins, had grown up in this town. He knew the Parkers, knew their hearts, and had already heard rumors of Lila's abandonment. "I have to do this by the book, Helen," he said quietly. "But I'm not blind. Let's get everyone's story." He sat with Lila, Helen, Tom, and Miss Betty, taking careful notes. Betty interpreted Lila's signs, her hands calm and steady. When Lila was asked what happened, she told her story with new courage. Her father had taken her into the woods, told her it was an adventure, then left her alone in the rain. She drew a picture for the sheriff, a car driving away, a little girl crying, a big dog standing guard. The room was silent as Lila finished her testimony. Shadow sat pressed to her side, his presence a silent wall of comfort. The sheriff's eyes glistened. "Thank you, sweetheart," he said, reaching for his notebook. "That was very brave. Word spread fast. Neighbors came forward. Those who had seen Jonathan's car in the woods. Those who'd helped care for Lila after the storm. Miss Betty wrote a statement attesting to Lila's emotional and physical condition when she arrived. Helen and Tom provided records, pictures, and Lila's own drawings to back up her story. Jonathan, undeterred, hired a lawyer from Portland. He returned to the farmhouse several times, demanding Lila be handed over. Each time, Shadow stood at the door, barking so fiercely that Jonathan refused to step closer. The Parkers, supported by Betty, the sheriff, and even the local school principal, refused to be intimidated. Lila is not property, Helen said calmly. She's a child. She deserves a voice. A court date was set. Tension crackled in the house as the day approached, the threat of losing Lila looming over everything. But Helen and Tom stood firm, refusing to let her be taken without a fight. They rallied the community, neighbors dropped off food, friends stopped by to practice new signs, and the sheriff checked in daily to ensure everyone's safety. Lila herself, though frightened, found new strength in her family and friends. With Betty's encouragement, she learned to sign not only her feelings, but also her memories. She practiced every night, rehearsing how to tell her story in court, how to sign danger, left, alone, dog, safe, family so clearly that no one could doubt her. On the eve of the hearing, Helen tucked Lila into bed, her heart heavy. "No matter what happens, we're with you," she promised, fingers spelling out the words. Shadow lay across Lila's feet, as if daring anyone to separate them. In that tense, uncertain moment, something extraordinary happened. Lila, who had once trembled at any stranger's touch, reached for Helen's hand and Shadow's collar at the same time. "Safe, family," she signed, her eyes bright with fierce, quiet hope. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, carrying with it the threat of another storm. But inside, the farmhouse glowed with the determined light of a family and a little girl, ready to fight for their right to stay together, no matter what came next. By the morning of the custody hearing, the small-town courthouse was alive with the hush of anticipation. Helen smoothed the wrinkles from Lila's dress, trying to hide her own nerves. Tom stood tall and silent beside them, his calloused hand resting on Lila's shoulder, while Miss Betty checked and rechecked her bag of notes and sign language guides. Shadow, freshly bathed and brushed, wore a new blue bandana for the occasion. He trotted beside Lila as if he understood the gravity of the day, his posture alert, his eyes following her every move. The community had shown up in force. Neighbors gathered outside, their faces anxious but resolute. Inside, the courtroom felt too big, the benches crowded with townsfolk, local teachers, and even the county's deaf advocacy group, drawn by word of Lila's story. Several members brought banners that read, "Every child deserves a voice and family is more than blood." Jonathan arrived in a crisp suit, his lawyer at his side. He barely looked at Lila as he took his seat, focusing instead on the judge, a stern, silver-haired woman named Judge Cortez, whose reputation for fairness was matched only by her intolerance for cruelty. The proceedings began with dry formalities, each side stating their case. Jonathan's lawyer argued for immediate restoration of custody, painting Jonathan as a concerned father who'd been unjustly separated from his daughter. He called Helen and Tom well-meaning but misguided strangers, and implied that the Parkers had manipulated Lila's memory. Helen, sitting tall beside Lila, met every accusation with calm, unwavering clarity. Tom spoke honestly of the night they found Lila, how she was sick and alone, how she clung to Shadow as if her life depended on it. Helen's voice never wavered as she described Lila's first night, the fever, the terror, and the slow, painstaking journey to trust. Miss Betty spoke next, signing as she talked, describing how Lila had blossomed in the safety of her new home. Then, it was Lila's turn. The court allowed Shadow to sit with her, a rare accommodation. Judge Cortez looked down kindly and said, "You may proceed, Miss Betty." The room held its breath as Lila took the witness seat, Shadow's head in her lap, her fingers tangled in his fur. Miss Betty translated gently as Lila signed her story. Her hands moved slowly at first. Night, storm, woods, daddy, alone, but grew steadier with every word. She described the car ride, the confusion, the ache in her throat as she waited for someone to come back. Her drawings were entered as evidence. A little girl standing in the rain, a car driving away, a dog with shining eyes. When asked who made her feel safe, Lila signed Helen, Tom, Miss Betty, Shadow, family. When asked if she wanted to return with her father, she shook her head, tears shimmering but unfallen, and signed Numperpers scared, alone, danger. Then she reached for Helen's hand and Shadow's collar at the same time, signing safe, love, family. The entire courtroom sat in silence, many wiping their eyes. The defense tried to undermine her testimony. Jonathan's lawyer implied that Lila, being so young and traumatized, could not remember clearly. He pointed to Jonathan, who sat stone-faced, and asked, "Don't you love your father?" Lila hesitated. Her hands moved slowly. "Want father love. Father left." The heartbreak in her face needed no translation. Miss Betty spoke for the local deaf advocacy group. She explained the importance of stability, communication, and belonging for children like Lila. "Language is not a luxury," she told the judge. "It's a lifeline." In the Parkers' home, Lila found her voice, her confidence, and her family, not because they share blood, but because they share love and respect. Neighbors took the stand. Mrs. Langley described seeing Jonathan's car near the woods the night of the storm. The school principal explained how Lila had blossomed in her new home. And even the sheriff described the investigation, how every piece of evidence supported Lila's story. Jonathan's defense faltered under the weight of so much community support. Still, he pressed on, his pride refusing to break. He testified that he'd tried everything for Lila, that he'd been overwhelmed, that he never meant to hurt her. He stopped short of confessing, but the guilt in his voice was unmistakable. When pressed, he could not explain why he hadn't reported Lila missing, or why he hadn't returned to the woods that night. Shadow's role was undeniable. The court officer, once skeptical, was moved by the way the dog responded to Lila's every sign and emotion. Judge Cortez even allowed Shadow to sit beside Lila through the entire hearing, noting, "It's clear this animal is not only a pet, but a support, perhaps even her protector." As the hours passed, tension mounted. Helen squeezed Lila's hand and signed brave as they waited for the judge's decision. Outside, the townspeople stood in silent vigil. The advocacy group passed out pamphlets about deaf rights and animal-assisted therapy. Some neighbors brought baked goods, others just held hands, all united in their hope that the system would do what was right. When Judge Cortez returned, the room fell still. She spoke with measured calm. "This court recognizes the gravity of these proceedings. The child's well-being is paramount. Lila Reed has made her wishes clear, in her own language, with the support of her chosen family and her dog, Shadow." She paused, glancing at Jonathan. "Mr. Reed, parenting is not a right, but a sacred responsibility. This court will not return a child to a home marked by abandonment and fear." The judge awarded temporary custody to the Parkers, pending a full investigation. Lila was allowed to remain in the only home where she'd ever truly felt safe. The courtroom erupted in relieved applause, neighbors hugging, Miss Betty dabbing her eyes. Helen and Tom holding Lila close as Shadow barked once, proud and protective. For Jonathan, it was a reckoning. His face collapsed, years of shame and denial finally breaking through. As he was led out of the courtroom, he paused, glancing back at Lila, just once. For the first time, something like understanding flickered in his eyes. Outside, as the sun broke through the clouds, Lila stepped into the light, Shadow at her side, Helen and Tom at her back. She signed family to the crowd, her hands high, her face shining with hope. The town cheered. For the first time, Lila felt the power of her own voice, the power of being seen, heard, and loved. The days after the court victory passed in a blur of gratitude and fragile relief. Lila clung tightly to Helen and Tom, her heart lighter, her hands quick to sign stories and questions, laughter spilling out in the warmth of home. The farmhouse filled with cards, flowers, casseroles, and gentle visits from neighbors and teachers. Even Miss Betty, who never missed a day, remarked how much brighter Lila's eyes seemed, how Shadow's tail never stopped wagging. Still, Helen and Tom carried a quiet vigilance. The legal battle wasn't truly over. The judge's order was only temporary. At any moment, the past could come roaring back. And then, one blustery afternoon, an unfamiliar car pulled into the long gravel drive. A tall, silver-haired woman stepped out, clutching a raincoat to her chest. Her features were sharp but kind, her expression tight with worry and something else, regret. Helen met her at the porch, Tom hovering behind, Shadow growling softly at the stranger. The woman's eyes filled with tears as soon as she saw Lila through the window. "I'm Evelyn Reed," she said, her voice trembling. "Jonathan's mother. I heard about Lila, about what happened. May I see her?" Helen hesitated, then nodded. "She's safe here," she said, "and loved." Evelyn nodded, pressing her lips together. "I know, I failed my son. I failed my granddaughter too, by pretending everything was fine." Her voice broke. "I want to do better now. I came as soon as I heard the truth." Inside, Lila stood frozen, eyes wide. She'd never met her grandmother before, but there was something familiar in the woman's careful movements, her gentle smile. Evelyn knelt down, opened her hands, and slowly, awkwardly, began to sign hello and family. She had learned just enough for this moment. Lila blinked, then offered a shy smile in return. With Miss Betty's help, Evelyn explained who she was. "You are so brave, Lila," she signed haltingly. "I want to be your grandmother, if you will let me." Lila glanced at Helen and Tom, who smiled encouragingly. She stepped forward, took Evelyn's hands, and signed family, yes, just as Shadow nestled between them all, as if to seal the promise. From that day, Evelyn became a steadfast ally. She moved into a small rental in town, visited daily, and threw herself into learning sign language. She practiced for hours with Miss Betty, joining Lila and the Parkers for lessons, chores, and long walks across the fields. The more time she spent with Lila, the more fiercely protective she became, ashamed of Jonathan's actions, but determined to give her granddaughter the love and support she had never given her own son. But peace was fleeting. Jonathan, left alone after the court hearing, grew desperate. The town watched him with wary eyes, neighbors whispering about the stormy man in the tidy suit who never smiled. Evelyn tried to speak with him, tried to explain how Lila needed more than blood, that she needed forgiveness and stability. But Jonathan turned away, pride wounded beyond repair. The tension built with the spring storms. One night, as clouds rolled in and thunder grumbled on the horizon, Helen grew uneasy. The farmhouse was shuttered, lights glowing softly in every window. Tom double-checked the locks. Lila sat curled on the sofa with Shadow, practicing her signs for safe help, family, while Helen read a story aloud, her hands moving in rhythm with the words. Suddenly, a crash of lightning split the sky, and the power flickered, then died. The house plunged into darkness, broken only by the faint glow of the emergency lantern in the kitchen. Shadow lifted his head, ears pricked, body tense. Lila signed danger, her face serious. Helen grabbed the flashlight and the small portable alarm system they had practiced with so many times before. Outside, through the howl of wind, there came a pounding at the back door. Tom moved quickly, ushering Lila and Helen behind him. But Lila, remembering every safety lesson, grabbed the alarm and pressed it, lights flashing, sirens shrieking through the house and out into the yard. Shadow barked furiously, teeth bared, placing himself squarely in front of Lila. The noise carried across the fields, where neighbors and even the sheriff could hear. The back door splintered. Jonathan burst in, wild-eyed, rain-soaked, shouting Lila's name. "Come on, we're leaving," he yelled, his voice breaking. "You're coming home with me now." But Lila did not freeze. She did not cower. She stood, heart hammering, Shadow at her side, and signed "No danger, family here." Shadow's barking grew deafening, blocking Jonathan's way. Helen and Tom stepped between them, Tom holding a heavy flashlight, Helen speaking with fierce calm. "You're not taking her, Jonathan. This is her home." In that moment, Evelyn appeared at the front door, having rushed over when the alarm sounded. Her face was drawn but determined. "Enough!" she shouted, her voice ringing out even over the storm. "Jonathan, you will not hurt her again. This ends now." Jonathan stared at his mother, realization crashing down. For the first time, he looked not at the adults, but at his daughter. Lila, trembling but unbowed, signed forgive, hope, family, then reached for Shadow's fur and Helen's hand. Evelyn stepped forward, putting herself between Jonathan and Lila. "If you do not leave, I will call the sheriff, and you will answer for every decision you've made. You are not above the law or love." The neighbors, drawn by the alarm, burst through the front gate, followed closely by the sheriff and his deputy. Jonathan, cornered by the crowd, lowered his arms, shoulders slumping, as the sheriff quietly took his statement. The storm outside roared on, but within the house something broke, an old chain of silence and fear, replaced by the steady thrum of solidarity and belonging. As the police escorted Jonathan away, Lila ran to Helen, Tom, and Evelyn. Shadow pressed close. The community filled the house, offering comfort, praise, and promises of protection. The threat was finally, truly gone. Later that night, after the house quieted and the storm faded, Lila lay in bed, Shadow curled against her. Helen, Tom, and Evelyn kissed her goodnight. Miss Betty signed proud, safe, love. Lila smiled, her hands resting atop Shadow's warm, steady heartbeat. Through the darkness, Lila whispered, just for herself, never alone again. The house that once stood as a quiet farmhouse on the edge of town now pulsed with life, laughter, and purpose. With Jonathan's rights terminated by the court and the threat of being taken away finally gone, Lila was formally adopted by Helen and Tom Parker. The adoption was a simple ceremony in the judge's chambers, yet it felt like the culmination of a miracle. Evelyn stood beside them, holding Lila's hand, while Miss Betty wiped tears from her eyes as Lila, with trembling but certain fingers, signed family forever and thank you to the judge. Shadow, in his finest blue bandana, sat proudly at Lila's side, earning a special mention from the judge herself. But healing did not mean forgetting the past. It meant turning scars into stories, pain into purpose. The Parkers, moved by Lila's journey and Shadow's unwavering loyalty, began talking about how to help others who had faced storms of their own. Over warm coffee and long evenings, an idea took root. A sanctuary where both traumatized children and dogs like Shadow could heal together, finding strength in one another. Helen drafted plans for the German Shepherd Healing Center, a place not just for Lila and Shadow, but for other deaf and traumatized children, and for abandoned or misunderstood German shepherds who needed a home. Tom took to the fields with his old tools, building new fences and play areas. Miss Betty offered to lead workshops in sign language, while Evelyn rallied support from her network of friends, surprising everyone, especially herself, with how persuasive she could be when the cause was love. The news spread quickly. The first children to arrive were shy and uncertain, each carrying their own silent wounds, each looking for a sign that this place would be different. Lila, now fluent in sign and brimming with a quiet confidence, greeted them at the door, Shadow beside her like a living promise. She signed welcome, safe, family, and offered her hand. Shadow licked every child's palm, wagging his tail so vigorously he nearly knocked over a flower pot. Helen and Tom worked hard to make the center feel like home. The walls were painted in bright colors, every room decorated with drawings and crafts from the children. There was always the scent of baking bread or cookies, and the yard was alive with the barks of playful dogs and the high-pitched laughter of children at last allowed to run free. Miss Betty's sign language classes became a centerpiece, not just for the kids, but for volunteers, neighbors, even the sheriff, who surprised everyone by becoming one of the most enthusiastic students. Each day, Lila and Miss Betty led small workshops. They taught the children how to introduce themselves in sign, how to tell someone if they were scared or needed help, and, most importantly, how to express joy. Shadow, now the official therapy dog, sat through every lesson, learning the signs as well. When a new child arrived, often too nervous to speak, Shadow would nuzzle close, offering comfort without a single word. Sometimes that was all it took for the first wall to fall. The center grew quickly. Soon, local social workers and foster agencies were calling to see if there was space for another child or another rescue dog. Helen created a scholarship fund. Evelyn helped run fundraisers, and Tom worked late into the night building new kennels and play structures. Each person who joined the cause brought a piece of their own story. A neighbor whose son was deaf, a teacher who wanted to learn ASL, a baker who brought treats every Friday. The center became more than a safe haven. It was a beacon, a community coming together to prove that love and effort could transform suffering into hope. Lila thrived in her new role. She taught younger children how to sign brave, strong love, using Shadow as her partner. She invented games that helped kids communicate with the dogs, laughing as they learned to sign sit, stay, friend, and cheered when a shy child managed to call a dog over with a wave. Miss Betty, her heart bursting with pride, watched as Lila stepped into the light of leadership. No longer the abandoned child in the woods, but a survivor and a guide. Sometimes in quiet moments, Lila would walk through the fields with Shadow, reflecting on how much her life had changed. She remembered the cold, muddy night in the forest, the soundless terror, the sting of betrayal, and the moment a stray dog's warm fur gave her a reason to hope again. She never forgot what it felt like to be voiceless, to be lost. That memory became her compass, guiding her as she welcomed every frightened new arrival with patience and empathy. The center celebrated its first anniversary with a joyful picnic. The lawn was filled with families, friends, children, and dogs of every size. Lila gave a small speech, using both voice and sign, thanking Helen, Tom, Evelyn, Miss Betty, and everyone who made the center possible. She introduced Shadow as her best friend and first hero, and together they led the kids in a raucous parade, hands signing and dogs barking, a festival of triumph and togetherness. Even Jonathan, far away in counseling, began sending short letters, never asking for forgiveness directly, but expressing pride in Lila and gratitude to the Parkers for giving her what he could not. Evelyn sometimes read them aloud to Lila, who listened quietly, her heart softening with each word. She learned that forgiveness was not for Jonathan's sake, but for her own peace. At night, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the center glowed with porch lights and laughter, Lila often sat with Shadow on the back steps. She would stroke his ears, look up at the stars, and sign softly, "Thank you, Hope, family." Knowing her story was now the foundation for countless others. For every storm that had threatened to destroy her, Lila had built a shelter for many. For every moment she had felt alone, she had created a family whose love reached further than words, deeper than scars, and brighter than the dawn. On a gentle morning a year after her adoption, Lila awoke to the soundless glow of sunlight streaming through her bedroom window. She rolled over to find Shadow already awake, tail sweeping the quilt in lazy arcs. Today was her 7th birthday. She could feel the day's energy humming through the house, the scent of cinnamon rolls baking, the laughter of children and volunteers already spilling into the hallway. But before rushing to join them, Lila paused, drawing in a long, contented breath. Her heart was full in a way she hadn't known possible. She pressed her hand to her locket, a talisman of the life she'd lost, but also a reminder of how far she'd come. She remembered, as if it were yesterday, the terror of that stormy night, the mud cold on her skin, the hopelessness closing in, the confusion, the hunger, the betrayal so deep she thought it might break her. Yet even in her most frightened moment, a small part of her had held on, whispering that rescue was possible, that somewhere out there, a hand or a paw might reach for her in the darkness. She sat up and Shadow immediately pressed his head to her chest, as if to say, "I'm here," just as he always had. Lila hugged him tight. "Thank you, boy," she whispered aloud, though she knew he didn't need words. Her hands signed friend, hero, always as she buried her face in his thick fur. Downstairs, the house was transformed for the celebration. Streamers hung from the beams, and cards from children, parents, and friends lined the mantel. Miss Betty greeted her with a hug, signing happy birthday with wide, looping motions. Helen bustled about with a tray of pancakes. Tom sang an off-key birthday tune, and Evelyn handed Lila a small, hand-painted music box, a symbol, she explained, of finding beauty and hope in unexpected places. The center was buzzing. Children ran across the yard, practicing signs with volunteers. German shepherds, each with their own stories of survival, tumbled and played among the kids. Neighbors and townsfolk brought homemade treats and balloons, every person eager to show Lila how much she mattered. Not just to them, but to the world. At noon, the crowd gathered in the big backyard, sunlight dappling through the leaves, for a special birthday circle. Lila, dressed in a yellow dress Helen had sewn for her, stood in the center with Shadow at her side and the community all around. Helen gently signed, "Do you want to say something, sweetheart?" Lila nodded. She looked around, at Helen, Tom, Evelyn, Miss Betty, her friends, and the sea of children and dogs whose lives had become entangled with her own. Then she raised her hands and began to sign, her voice quiet but clear, with Miss Betty interpreting for the crowd. "When I was lost in the woods," she signed, "I thought I would always be alone. I was scared and angry, and I didn't know how to trust anyone anymore. I felt like being different. Being deaf meant I didn't belong. I thought I was broken. She paused, meeting the eyes of the newest arrivals, kids who still wore the look of heartbreak, whose hands trembled as they tried to sign along. But Shadow found me, and then all of you did. You showed me that being different is not a weakness. It can be a strength. My deafness helped me learn a new language, a language of hands and faces and kindness. I learned that real family is about love, not just blood. When I was angry with my father, I felt trapped by the past. But forgiving him helped me feel free. I let go of the pain so I could move forward, so I could help others find hope too. Helen and Tom blinked back tears. Even Jonathan, standing quietly at the edge of the crowd, invited by Evelyn, encouraged by his counselor, looked down, overcome by emotion. He had begun to change, sending small, tentative letters to Lila, attending therapy, trying in his own way to seek redemption. Lila continued, her signs flowing confidently, her gaze direct. I'm not a victim. I'm not just a survivor. I'm a leader now. And every time one of you learns to sign, every time a new child finds a friend, or a dog finds a home, we grow stronger together. Miss Betty's hands flew with pride as she translated. What we build here is not just for us. It's for anyone who's ever felt lost or left behind. It's for everyone who needs a place to start again. Forgiveness is hard, but it's how we take our power back. Hope is what happens when we believe that tomorrow can be better, and that we can help make it so. The crowd erupted in applause, a wave of hands raised high, the deaf community's sign for cheering. Lila blushed, hugging Shadow as he barked once, proud as ever. The rest of the afternoon was filled with laughter and celebration. Kids ran obstacle courses with the dogs, volunteers set up a craft table for thank you cards, and the local bakery donated a mountain of cupcakes. Lila spent time with every new arrival, sharing her story, sometimes through signs, sometimes through drawings, always with a smile that said, I see you. I understand. As the sun set, a quiet peace settled over the center. Lila stood with Shadow beneath the old oak tree, watching the sky turn gold and pink. She remembered her first nights here, how small she'd felt, how afraid of letting anyone in. Now, surrounded by her chosen family and the ever-growing circle of friends and allies, Lila felt stronger than she'd ever imagined possible. She had learned that her disability was actually her superpower, a unique way of seeing the world, of connecting with others, of inspiring hope. The center's success proved that love, communication, and community could turn even the deepest wounds into sources of strength. As darkness fell, Lila knelt beside Shadow, signing softly, "Thank you, family, hope." She pressed her forehead to his and smiled, certain that she would never again be truly alone. And in the warm, glowing house behind her, a legacy of compassion, courage, and healing continued to grow, one that would outlast any storm. The second summer at the German Shepherd Healing Center dawned bright and full of promise, the fields waving green in the warm Oregon breeze. It was the center's annual celebration, and people arrived in waves, old friends, new families, teachers, advocates, children from all over the region, and of course dozens of joyful, barking German shepherds. Banners fluttered above the barn doors, reading "Where no one is left behind, and every storm can lead to sunrise." The air thrummed with excitement and community spirit. Lila, now 8 years old, moved confidently among the guests, her hands dancing in sign, her smile as easy as the sunlight. She was a fixture here, a leader, a symbol, a living testament to the power of second chances. Shadow followed faithfully, aging but still sturdy, always by her side. Children flocked to them for reassurance and play, while adults marveled at the bond between girl and dog, and at all the center had become. Helen and Tom, a little older, a little grayer, greeted each newcomer as family. Evelyn presided over the kitchen, serving food and sharing stories with volunteers, while Miss Betty ran the sign language workshops and made sure every nervous child felt included. The center hummed with laughter, learning, and love, a symphony of voices and hands, of barking and cheers. This year, Lila was asked to give the keynote speech, a moment she had once thought impossible. The dining hall was packed, the big windows flung open to let in the breeze and the songs of birds. When Lila stepped up to the small stage, dressed in a sky-blue dress, the whole crowd fell silent in anticipation. At her side, Miss Betty stood ready to interpret, though more and more Lila's signs were understood by all. Lila paused, surveying the room. So many faces, so many stories woven together. She placed her hand on Shadow's head and looked out at her community. Then she began to sign, her movements graceful, her voice steady, as she spoke for all to hear. When I first came here, I was scared. I was lost, and I did not believe in miracles. I didn't know what it meant to be truly seen, to be understood, to be loved by a family, not just the family you're born into, but the family you choose. Her hands spoke as much as her words, painting her story in the air. A storm left me alone, but a dog, a teacher, and a new family showed me the way home. At first, I thought my differences made me weak. Now I know they are my strength. My voice is in my hands, in my heart, in the way I help others who feel lost. And I am not alone. None of us are, not here. She smiled at the children gathered near the front, some signing along, others simply watching with wide, hopeful eyes. Every person here, every dog, every act of kindness, and every hard day survived. It all matters. It all changes the world, a little at a time. I used to think storms only took things away, but now I see that sometimes storms clear the way for new things to grow. Sometimes the worst days of our lives lead us to the very best. She paused, searching the crowd for Jonathan. Her father stood near the back, his posture shy but present, tears bright in his eyes. He had traveled a long, hard road toward forgiveness, one letter and phone call at a time. Today, for the first time, he stood as part of the circle, not as a shadow, but as a father learning to love and support, however imperfectly. Lila nodded at him and continued, "Forgiveness is the hardest thing I have ever learned, but it set me free. It let me grow, and it opened the door for love and hope. Here at the center, we teach each other how to listen, not just with our ears, but with our hearts. We learn together, we heal together, and we remind each other every single day that nobody has to walk alone." She reached out her hand to a little girl who had arrived just that morning, trembling and silent, clutching a battered teddy bear. Lila knelt, introduced herself in sign, then gently guided the girl's hands, teaching her the sign for safe. Shadow nosed forward, his tail wagging, as the girl smiled for the first time. The room erupted in a wave of applause, hands raised and waving, the beautiful silent cheer of the deaf community mingling with joyful voices and the barking of happy dogs. Helen and Tom wrapped Lila in a hug. Evelyn kissed her cheek. Miss Betty's eyes shone with tears of pride. Jonathan, for the first time, joined the circle, his hand resting tentatively on Lila's shoulder. The center was alive with the energy of transformation, a place where suffering had been turned into strength, where every heartbreak was honored, and every small victory celebrated. As the celebration continued, Lila moved through the crowd, helping children settle in, introducing them to Shadow, teaching them the signs for family, hope, and courage. She knew each story was different, each wound unique, but she believed deeply that healing was possible. Here, no one was ever left behind. As evening fell and the sun painted the sky in gold and purple, the center glowed with lanterns, music, and laughter. Lila sat on the porch steps with Shadow, looking out at the place that was now her legacy. She watched as a new child, timid and uncertain, arrived with a caseworker and felt a surge of purpose. Rising, she went to greet the newcomer, signing welcome and family, and placing a reassuring hand on the child's shoulder. The camera would pan out, across the bright windows, the signing hands, the dogs playing on the lawn, the circle of people united in joy and resilience. Lila, once abandoned, was now the center of something powerful and lasting. The storms that had once threatened to destroy her had instead taught her to bend, to grow stronger, to lead. Letting go of the past had freed her to shape a future not just for herself, but for everyone who came after. By giving others a voice, she had discovered her own power. Through Shadow, she learned that trust, loyalty, and love need no words. Every child healed, every dog rescued, every act of kindness. These were the seeds that would grow long after Lila's story was told. As the stars appeared, Lila whispered into Shadow's ear, "We did it, boy. We really did." And as the center echoed with laughter and hope, it was clear that this was only the beginning of 1,000 new stories, where every storm would someday lead to sunrise.